Hello and welcome. This video will cover a complete walkthrough of the authoring process for a basic project in WorkLink Create. We'll begin by showing the project in its completed state, then return to a completely blank brand new project and author to that completed state. To follow along with this video, you will need a computer with a keyboard and a 3-button mouse, as well as access to the WorkLink Create software suite. Let's get started. Okay, we're going to begin with simulating the completed state of the project so we can understand the goal that we are authoring towards. So here we're in WorkLink Create at create.scopear.com. I'm in simulation mode, and I'm just going to go ahead and do a brief walkthrough of this project. As you can see, it begins with a basic menu presenting the user with 3 options to navigate to. The first is an asset overview showing basic callouts and a little bit of information about this ventilator asset. The next is a 3-step process for removing the battery on this asset. That includes removing the screws, removing the rear cover, and removing the battery itself. Finally, we also have the reverse process, the 3-step process for replacing the battery, including some highlight spheres and color changes as well. So a relatively basic project, but a good way to get started with authoring in WorkLink Create. So I'm now going to close out of this tab. And here I have a completely blank project. This is what it will look like after you have logged into create.scopear.com with your username and password. Hit that new project button and given your project a name. So if you're planning to follow along with this video, I would make sure that you're at this place as well, and then we can begin the authoring process. Okay, so to get started, let's go through a basic tour of some of the windows we have here in WorkLink Create. The main window is the scene view, and this is a 3-dimensional view of all the assets that are in your scene. That's both 2D and 3D assets. Next to it, we have the step hierarchy, and this is the list of assets that are in your scene. So right now we can see in here, it looks empty, but there's actually 2 directional lights. And if we zoom way, way, way out here, you can see those 2 lights floating up there. And as I select them, I can highlight them both. We also have the asset library. This is the home for all the 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional assets you're going to use in authoring your AR experience. You can see it's divided into personal assets and company assets. Personal assets are assets that you have uploaded either by clicking this Upload Files button or by dragging them into the asset library from your local storage. Additionally, there are company assets. These are assets that have been exposed to everyone in your organization by dragging them from personal assets to company assets, and that can be by you or by another user. So a good way to share content between multiple authors. So to begin the authoring process, the first thing we will need to do is add content to our scene. However, we want to make sure that we add content to the right place. So we can see our experience is divided into sequences and steps. You can kind of imagine these like chapters and paragraphs. And for each chapter, we have a default state. You can kind of picture the default state, we're going to use a different metaphor here, like the stage on which this entire AR experience is going to play out. And what I mean by that is anything you add to the default state here will automatically be added to every single step in your sequence. And this has several advantages. The first is that now the assets that are in our step are references to the asset in the default state. And that saves on memory when loading this on a mobile device because we no longer have to store a 3D model for each step. We just store one 3D model on the default state and all the steps reference it. Second, it also allows for rapid updating of projects because if I update the model on the default state step, it updates that model across all other steps as well. So that includes simple things like color changes and also more complex things like changing position or adding and removing parts. Finally, it makes our authoring process faster because we don't have to add content to each step. It's all automatically there. So With that brief explanation, let's begin by adding a piece of content to our default state. And this is how you're going to begin with any project. So for this project, we're using the ventilator asset, and that's available under Company Assets, 3D Content. We're down in the asset library here, and then there's this ventilator asset. And I can drag this thing and add it to my scene, either by dragging it directly into the scene view or by dragging it into the step hierarchy. So I'm going to go ahead and drop it in the step hierarchy there. You can see it's going to load in. And now we have our ventilator asset here that we can interact with. So let's talk about the kind of interactions we can do. So first, a basic overview for navigating the scene view. There are a few basic controls that we're going to use to make sure that we can look around our scene with ease. So the first is what I've been showing already a little bit, which you might say look around or to orbit for those of you with more experience in 3D. So I'm going to hold the Alt key and click down on the left mouse button. So Alt key, left mouse button. That allows me to orbit around my selected object, in this case the ventilator. So as I drag, see I'm able to look around quite nicely here. Additionally, we can zoom in and out, and that can be done two different ways. The first is by rolling the scroll wheel on top of the mouse. So as I roll that scroll wheel in and out, I'm able to zoom in and out of my scene. I can also hold the Alt key and the right mouse button and drag, and that will allow me to quickly zoom in and out. So Alt, left mouse button and drag, that's to orbit. Alt, right mouse button and drag, that's to zoom in and out. Finally, we can pan, or for gamers, maybe strafe. That is holding the center mouse button. So that's the button underneath the scroll wheel. And as I hold that mouse button down and drag, I can pan along side to side. So pan, orbit, and zoom. Those are kind of three ways to make sure that we can look around safely in our scene. Additionally, we have a few tools up here. So the home button, this top one shaped like a little house, takes you back to a sort of basic home view. So that's just returning to this sort of basic 3/4 view of the front of our scene. We also have this button shaped like a crosshair, and this focuses in on the selected object. So right now I have the entire ventilator selected, and it's going to focus in on that. But if I click on maybe a specific part of it and click again, you can see it's focusing in on that ventilator. So that's a different thing from the home view. We're going to be focusing in on a specific thing. Finally, we have the ability to switch between orthographic and perspective views. If you know what that means, you know what that means. Otherwise, we save that explanation for another video. Finally, we have our view cube here. This is basically a way to quickly look at different views of our scene. So looking at it from the top, from the front, from the side. So you can also navigate around by clicking on the view cube. Okay, so we have our basic piece of content, and we have the ability to navigate around the scene. So now let's talk about how to move content within the scene. That's going to be done with the gizmo up here in the top corner. So right now you can see I have it set on the translate gizmo. So as I select my ventilator, which I can do either by clicking on it in the step hierarchy or by clicking on it in the scene, we're presented with this 3-axis gizmo to move this asset around. So I can click on each axis individually to drag that asset along the selected axis. So that's up and down, forward and back, left and right. I can also click on these panels that select any 2 axes and allow me to move the object in that plane, you might say. So up and to the side, up and forward, and to the side and forward. You can also click on the center here to drag the object around. However, I would caution you to not do that because it's basically moving the object along the plane that you're looking at, and it can be very difficult to see what that's actually doing as you move your object. So As we're getting started in Create, I would encourage you to exclusively move things by selecting one axis at a time and moving it along that axis. Okay, so that's basic moving. If I wanted to make sure that I can undo those, I can click Control Z. I can also go over into the Object Properties window. This is this window on the side labeled Object Properties. You can see a bunch of properties about the object we have selected. So its name, whether it's part of the group, visibility mode. What we're going to focus on right now is this transform tool down here. So this transform tool is giving me numerical values for the transforms that I'm performing with the gizmo. So you can see as I drag this along that x-axis, that x value is changing, etc., etc. So just to make sure this thing is exactly back where we started, I'm going to go and click in here and 0 all of these values. And that's just going to quickly and efficiently make sure that my asset is back right at the origin where I want it. Okay, so that's the move gizmo. Similarly, we have a rotation gizmo, and this allows us to rotate the object in any one of the three axes. So x-axis rotations, z-axis rotations, and y-axis rotations. And again, I can always come back and 0 out those after I've played with them by using the Object Properties window, transforms, and zeroing them out. Another interesting feature of this rotation gizmo is we have the ability to snap to particular degrees of rotation. So if I hold Control and then click on one of these axes and start to move, you can see that's now snapping to 15-degree increments of rotation. And if you want to change those increments, that's in the snap settings up here. So you can see right now rotation is set to 15. I could change that to something else if I wanted to, but for now, we're just going to stick with that. So that's a good way if I wanted to select this object and make sure that it's perfectly vertical. I could hold Control, and then I could ensure that it's going to snap to a point that's exactly -90. Or any other value that you might want. All right, going to go back and 0 that real quick. Finally, you can also use the scale gizmo. And so this is going to scale the object in any of the three axes. So I can make it wider, I can make it taller, I can make it wider in a different direction, you might say, or control all three of them at once that I would do by clicking over here. So I'm going to go ahead and 0 these, or actually, I wouldn't 0 these. These should be set to 1. And you can see it's behaving a little bit funny right now. So what's happened is this button links and unlinks these three scale factors. So right now, because they're linked, if I make changes to one, it's automatically going to scale the others to make sure that the proportion of the object stays the same. So because I used this gizmo to make this thing oddly proportioned, I want to unlink these, make sure that all the scales are set to 1, and then relink them. And so now, if I take this x value and change it to 2, you can see the object scales uniformly in the x, y, and z axes up to 2. For now, we want to keep it at 1. Just a quick side note here. You can see that this project is about to autosave. So that's a feature that is built into Create. You can see right now it says down at the bottom, it lists autosave enabled every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes, Create is going to automatically save the current progress of the project. That just means that you're never at risk of losing more than 10 minutes worth of work. Okay, so we have our asset. We've talked about how to look around and navigate in our scene, and we've also covered the basic gizmo tools to manipulate our asset. The final thing we should cover before authoring is how to resize the windows that we're looking at here. So we've already covered that we have the step hierarchy, the asset library, timeline editor, object properties window, and this entire system is basically divided into these different sections. Well, if you click in between any two sections, you can actually resize those windows to maybe make sure that we're getting a better view of the scene view or to have more control over our object properties, whatever we're using at the time. Additionally, we have dockable windows. So if I grab something like the step hierarchy, I can pull it out and I can undock it, and then it will just be a floating window. I can also then redock it with another window or place it in any location around that I want. And there's quite a lot of functionality built into this dockable windows, so I would encourage you to take some time and play around with that and understand what all those controls are. And eventually, as you become a more experienced author, you'll be able to build your own layouts that work best for you. Given that, if you've been playing around with it a little bit, you might have gotten to a place where everything's sort of a mess and you can't find things or things not in the layout that you want. You come up to this window drop down at the top here under workspace. So window, workspace. You can always return to the default workspace. So if I click on this, it's just going to jump us back to exactly that default workspace that we started with when they opened this project. So there's always a way to get back here if you start playing around with the windows and get kind of lost in that. Okay, so now we want to begin the process for authoring our project. So if we remember back to the demo that began this video, the first thing we want to add is a menu. So we're going to go to step 1 here. So this is sequence 1, step 1, and we are going to begin creating a menu. So the first step to that is we're going to want to toggle on the visibility of the UI here. So as I click this button, you can see a little yellow outline has appeared and some other controls. So this is a representation of the two-dimensional UI that our user is going to see on their phone or tablet screen or in a floating window in a Microsoft HoloLens. And that's going to allow them to interact with this scene, to click forward and backward or to click on links and menu buttons. So the way we add content to this UI is over here in the UI editor. So the UI editor is where we can edit all the UI interface that the user is going to see. So going down, the first thing we begin with are templates. And these are pre-authored templates that are included with WorkLink Create to help you get started building out your UI. You can then customize those templates as much as you need to suit your particular company's colors or aesthetic or the use case for the project that you're doing. But for now, we're just going to stick with one of the basic ones. So as I click down here, I'm going to select this title menu parentheses 6. So as I select that, you can see now this UI has been populated with several different things. We have a title up here and then 6 options that we can control. So as I start scrolling down here, the first thing we're going to do is change the title of this project. So this project is a create demo, and that's going to be its title. The subtitle, let's just describe the asset that we're working on. So that's going to be the ventilator asset. As we move down, we can now see a menu that allows us to control the options we have. So there are 6 options divided into 2 columns. For the purposes of this demonstration, we only need 3 of those options, and we really only need 1 column. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to a single column, and I'm going to hide the bottom 3 options. So now we only have option 1, option 2, and option 3 that are visible here. I was hiding them by clicking these little eye-shaped icons to change their visibility. Okay, so now we can go through and customize these individual options. So the first option that's going to lead to the first area in our experience is going to be an asset overview. And that is where we're going to add in some callouts and other pieces of content to give the user a basic overview of the asset we're working with. The next option is to remove the battery. And finally, the third option is to replace the battery. Okay, so now we have these 3 options here, but how do we tell the system where those options lead? So I'm going to go ahead and hide the bottom 2 for now, and I'm just expanding and hiding these using this arrow icon here. And just focus on the first option. So you can see we have some customizability here for colors, background colors, and the color of this little outline on it. Finally, we have this target. And the target is what's going to allow us to link this button to take the user to any step that exists in our entire experience. So once we've built a step that acts as our asset overview, we're going to come back and set this target to that step. And that will tell the system when the user clicks on this element, they should be directed to that step. And you'll see this kind of target interface throughout Create. So now we have our basic menu established. The last thing we can do is scroll to the bottom, and we're going to hide the previous step and next step buttons. Those are these two little fletching arrows on either side that allows users to navigate left and right through the steps. So because this is a menu, we only want the user to be able to click on the menu buttons. We don't need the step icons. Okay, so we've built out our basic menu step. I'm going to go up here to the step itself and double click on it to rename it menu. That's just going to help me with organization as I go and author more steps to be clear about where I am in my scene sequences. I'm also going to take this first sequence and double click on it and rename it to menu sequence. So it's again just kind of helping with organization to make sure we know this is the menu sequence and here's the menu step. Okay, so we have a menu and now we need to add some content. So the first piece of content we're going to add is this asset overview. So to do that, we're going to click this plus icon here. That plus icon is going to create a new blank sequence, but it's going to copy the default state from this sequence. So because I added the ventilator to the default state here, when I click this button, we now have a fresh sequence, but we can see that default state already includes this ventilator asset. So that's just a nice feature that we don't have to add this guy again, it's already here. So this sequence, I'm going to double click on it and rename it the asset overview. And again, similar, the step is going to be the overview step. So for this step, we don't really need very much two-dimensional UI. The user is not going to be reading anything or clicking anything in the scene. They're going to be looking at the asset itself and the callouts and other elements we're going to add to it. So in terms of the UI, the only thing I'm going to do is hide that next step button because there's nowhere for the user to go after this. They can just come into the asset overview and then click that back button, which will return them to the menu sequence. This is a good time to note as a general piece of knowledge that this button here is not a previous step button, it is a back button. And what I mean by that is if I had a menu that linked me to step 7 in the sequence, for example, this button would not take the user to step 6 if they came here from the menu. It would take them back to the menu. It would only take them back to step 6 if they went from step 6 to step 7. So this button is take me to the last place that I was, not take me back one step. Just an important note. Okay, so we have the ventilator here, and now we're going to add some callouts to it. So a callout is a floating three-dimensional label that points to a specific part of the asset and gives information about it. So in order to do that, we're going to select a particular part of this asset. So the callout is going to point to the geometric center of whatever we have selected. So we want to make sure that we're pointing it to the part that we want to highlight. So in this example, I'm going to select this on-off key. So this is its own 3D element, this on-off key here, and we're going to want to add a callout to it that labels it. So to do that, we go back to the object properties window up here. And as we scroll down through these object properties, we see material and some other things. As we keep scrolling down and get to the bottom, we see this menu for a callout. We can click next to that to enable it. And so now, as I zoom back out a little bit, you can see this callout has been added, points directly to that on-off key there. And it's already actually been populated with the object name. So this callout is going to automatically populate with the name of the object. However, for my purposes, the name of the object, while good, is maybe not exactly intuitive to read because it uses underscores. So I'm just going to change this to on-off key. You can change that to whatever you want. I'm also going to delete the text out from underneath it because I don't really need to describe what this thing does. I'm just saying it's an on-off key. Actually, I'm going to go back and add a slash in here. Okay, so I've added a callout that points to this on-off key. The final thing I want to do is change the location of this callout relative to the key. So that's what this offset menu down at the bottom here does. This offset menu allows me to change the offset of the callout relative to the asset we're selecting. So I'm going to change this to be minus 0.1 in the X and 0.2 in the Y, and I'm going to keep the Z as is. That's just so that this callout now points a little bit more cleanly to the on-off key that we're wanting to work with here. Okay, so that's the most linear method to add a callout, is to select the object we want to have a callout pointing to and add it. However, there are situations where we might not have an individual object for the thing we want to point to, or the pivot point, the center for that object, is not set where we want it to be. So in the example of the ventilator here, if I go back and click on the entire assembly, as we look around, we can see that pivot point is actually at the bottom of this thing. And so if I really quickly just enable a callout, you can see it kind of points weirdly through this object, and maybe we don't like that. So another way to add a callout is to create what's called an empty object. So within the WorkLink Create software suite, you have the ability to create a few different elements that are not things that you bring in through the asset library. And those are in this drop-down menu at the top here labeled Create. See, there's a list of a lot of different things that we can create. We can add cubes and cylinders and planes and spheres. We can add 3D text, etc., etc. But for what we're doing right now, what we want to add is an empty object. So I'm going to click on this, and we can see that this element has appeared that is an empty object. And what this thing is a pivot point without any geometry associated with it. So it's basically just a labeled point in space. And we can also see over on the step hierarchy here, if I click away from this very briefly, it has a different icon. So the lights have their own little light icon. The ventilator, because it has geometry, it's shown as a solid cube. This empty object is shown as basically an empty cube, indicating that what we're selecting here is an empty object. So just a nice visual way to be able to navigate and understand what we're working with. So we can add callouts to empty objects the same way we can add callouts to everything else. And the power of this is if I add a callout to this thing right now, you can see its center, we haven't moved it yet, so it's still doing the same funny thing. But as I move this, the callout is going to follow it. And so that actually allows me to label anything I want at any point I want very easily. So I think I'm going to use this to label the screen of this asset. So I'm just going to look around here and slowly move this thing until it's basically pointing right at the center of the screen on this ventilator. I can now go down, change the name to screen, change the text to shows information. Again, just kind of putting whatever here, it doesn't really matter. And finally, change those offsets a little bit. So maybe I only want this to be an offset of 0.2 and 0.2, maybe even 0.15 and 0.2. So now I have two callouts here, one that was made by selecting an object within the scene, and one that was made by using an empty object. So if you've been following along so far, I would encourage you to pause very briefly and take a moment and add two more callouts to your scene. Add one that is pointing to a specific object, maybe the handle on top here, and add another one that is using an empty object. And just as a quick aside, we can make that process faster by right-clicking on this empty object and duplicating it. So that works for anything. You can right-click on any element of the scene and duplicate it. But if I duplicate this empty object here, you can see I now have a second one to play with that already has a callout associated with it. And then I just have to go out and change the name of this callout. So pause for a moment, and we'll get started in a sec. All right, so assuming that you've gone and added two more callouts, we're now going to add one more piece to this asset overview, and that is arrows indicating the inlet and outlet for this thing. So we can go back over to the asset library under company assets and 3D content, we have a folder labeled arrows, and these are a collection of pre-provided arrow-shaped assets that we can work with. So we're now going to select, I'm going to use arrow short, and I'm going to drag that into the step hierarchy here. You can see now this element has appeared that I can work with. And again, it's appeared at the geometric center, but if I use my gizmo, I can move this element to align it wherever I want. So for me, I'm using these arrows to show the inlet and outlets. I'm going to move this arrow until it's pointed pretty much straight at that inlet right there. Just a sec. Okay, pretty happy with that placement. I think that arrow works quite well to show the inlet. Let the autosave happen. I'm now going to right-click on that and duplicate it so I have a second arrow. Drag it over and use it to show the outlet. And since it's facing the wrong way, I can now switch my gizmo to the rotation. I'm going to use that control trick we talked about earlier, where I hold control and then click to rotate this and make sure that I get it rotated exactly 90 degrees, or 180 degrees rather. Then grab my movement gizmo and just try and do my best to line this thing up with the outlet. So once I've done that, I now have some callouts labeling this ventilator, and I also have arrows showing the inlet and outlet. One other thing we can talk about very briefly here is looking back at the step hierarchy. You can see now we've added some elements with green and some elements that are highlighted in red. And what that's indicating is it's showing us which of these elements exist in our default state and which elements are unique to this step. So right now the ventilator, remember, comes from our default state. So that has a little green logo next to it. Whereas these arrows only exist in the step that we're working on. And so those are indicated in red. And that is a visual cue for which elements and which things are in the default state that will be consistent throughout the software. So in other places where you see elements with a green or a red label next to them, that is showing whether or not it's the same as what's in the default state. So you can see over here in the object properties, you can see these little green lines. Those will change to red as you make changes to the position or rotation of this thing as well. Okay, so we have our asset overview and our overview step. Now we want to begin authoring the linear set of instructions that will show the user how to remove the battery. So I'm going to go ahead and click that plus button again. We now have our new fresh sequence. We're going to call this sequence remove battery. And this step we're going to leave labeled as step 1 because it will be the first step in a 3-step process. Okay, so now we're going to return to adding a new kind of UI. And for that, we're going to hop over to the UI editor. We're going to select the content template. And this is a basic template used for content steps within a sequence. So something that's best when we have a linear set of steps that we're going to walk through. You can see this template is broken up into a few different sections. For today, we're going to not worry about this inset, so I'm actually just going to close that. And we're going to start by looking at the headers. So we have 4 headers. These are the 4 headers across the top of the screen here. And for this process, I think we only really need to show 2 of them. So I'm going to go ahead and hide 2 of the headers and leave the other 2 that we can then manipulate. So this first header, I'm going to use the arrow to expand it so I can edit it. I'm going to call this main menu. And the reason is we always want to give our user a way to get back to the main menu. So on the asset overview step, that was that back button there because it was always going to take them back to the main menu. It was the only way they could access it. In this case, because there's going to be 3 steps, then on this first step, if they click this back button, it'll take them back to the main menu. But once they click the next step button, then this previous step button would only take them back to the last step they were on. So we want to make sure they have a button they can click that will take them back to the main menu. So to do that, I took this header, I wrote main menu in it. I'm now actually going to quickly change the color just to indicate that it's a button. So I'm going to make the text black and the background white, just so we can see that this is a main menu, leads us somewhere different. Finally, I'm now actually going to use this target interface that we talked about earlier. So this target is telling the system that this is now a button that should lead them back to the main menu. So to do that, I'm going to go into this target, select step, go to the menu sequence, which we've labeled, and that menu step, and click confirm. And now we can see that target shows menu sequence, menu step. And when a user clicks on it, it's always going to take them back there. All right, this next header, we are going to populate with the step count. So we want to show the current step that we're on and the total number of steps. Well, WorkLink Create has support for text variables, so we can actually enter that as a text variable. A variable is indicated by starting with a hashtag. So as soon as I type that hashtag there, you can see I'm given a drop-down menu of the available variables that I can use. In this case, the first variable I want to select is step number. So if I click on that, you can see this is now populated with hashtag step number. And down in the UI, we can see a number 1 here. This is step 1, so we get step number is 1. I'm then going to add a slash, and this is not part of the text variable, this is just an element. And then add another hashtag to count the step total. So this will show the total number of steps in our sequence. Right now, because there's only one step, we can see that's 1, and we're on step 1 out of 1. But as we begin adding steps 2 and 3, that number is going to continuously update to reflect the number of steps. So this is just going to save us time, where we don't have to go in and type in the step number every single time. And because this doesn't need to go anywhere, we don't need to set a target for this header. This is done as is. Okay. Finally, we're going to add a description for this step. So what we want the user to do is remove 2 screws from the back of the ventilator. Okay, so we have our text description and our entire user interface built out. So the next step to creating this experience is to add in the animations that the user will see as they are on this step. So to do that, we're going to work with the timeline editor down here. So the timeline editor is the home for all of our animations within a given step. The animations will start as soon as the user clicks to the step, and they will progress until they hit this blue line here. That's the repeat line. Once they hit this blue line, they will then start over. So we're going to begin and add some animations. So the first thing we want to do is direct our user's attention, because you have to remember AR as a medium is very free in that we can't ensure that the user is going to be looking exactly where we want them to look. They're going to have their phone, their tablet, or their HoloLens, and they could be looking at the front of this thing, they could be looking at the side of it, they could be looking off into space over here and have no idea what's going on. So we want to do the best we can to direct the user's attention exactly where it needs to be. And one tool we have for that is adding a highlight sphere. So how do we do that? Well, let's begin by selecting the important things that we want the user to focus on. In this case, these 2 screws that we want them to remove. So there's screw 1, and over there is screw 2. So I'm actually going to control click and make sure I have both screws selected. And I'm going to add selected to timeline. That's this button down here in the timeline editor that says add selected to timeline. And when I do that, you can see battery screw 1 and battery screw 2, the same names that are in the step hierarchy, have now been added to the timeline. And they have their own little row. And in this row, this channel, we are going to add in events that will happen to these screws over time. Those are called time bars. So what's the first event we want to have happen? Well, the first event we want to have happen is we want a highlight sphere to direct the user's attention to this screw. So I'm going to click add time bar right here. And from the options that I have, I'm going to hit add highlight sphere. So now you can see this element has appeared. It's a second long, going from 0, 0 to 0, 1, and it's a highlight sphere. Now, if I double click on this, I can control more detailed properties of this. And the only one that I'm concerned about is the color. So you can pick any color you would want. For me, I'm going to use maybe like a nice bright pink. Okay, so if I now click play, and I'm going to deselect these just to make it easier to see, you can see there's a highlight sphere that happens to that screw in that kind of bright pink color. Now, looking at this, it's fairly large, but honestly, if I was looking at the front of this thing, maybe I would see that, maybe I wouldn't. So I'm going to go ahead and make this slightly larger. I'm going to change the diameter to 0.2. And if I now go back, you can see that highlight sphere. Okay, I think that's pretty large. That's good enough for what I want. So I now have a highlight sphere for this screw. Now we could add the highlight sphere to the second screw as well right now. However, what we're actually going to do is create all of the time bars we want for the one screw, and then we're just going to copy and paste them to the second one at the end. So first, we indicate to the user, hey, look over here, this is the screw you want to work with. And we've added a highlight sphere to do that, but I'm actually going to add a second channel and do even another thing to help direct the user's attention. And that is set object color. So I'm adding another time bar, and this is a set object color time bar. And what this is going to do is actually change the color of that screw to something else. So you can actually see, I believe these are set to the same color, and they are, which is good. So I now have this set object color. I'm going to relocate this so it starts about halfway through that highlight sphere happening. And now if I click play, you can see that that object quickly flashes to another color. And actually that happens a little too fast for me, so I'm going to extend that to about 2 seconds. And now, see that color change gives the user a pretty good indication of where they should be looking, that that's the screw they should be focusing on. Just a brief aside, you can see I've been using these controls down here. This control brings that red line back to the beginning. It's kind of like start the animation over again. The play pause button plays and pauses the animations as you would expect. Okay, so we've directed the user's attention to the asset we want them to focus on. Now we want to actually add the animation for what's going to happen to that asset. So to do that, we can use this record button. And this record button is similar to keyframing in some other animation applications that you might be familiar with. So if I now select this screw and I hit record, I can then do the motion that I want this screw to do and then stop recording. And you can see the system has automatically added a new channel, a position channel, and then added in a time bar that corresponds to that translate that I just did. So I'm going to move this to make sure that it starts right after that object color ends. And if I click back to the beginning and now play, that highlight sphere happens, the color change, and then the screw moves out. And that's all a nice linear set of steps. So one important thing to note about this record button, and I'm just going to do a quick demonstration here. You can follow along with this if you want, but this is just kind of an aside. It's not important to completing the basic project. So the record button only records the beginning and ending positions of the screw. So where was it when you hit that button, and where was it when you hit that button again? Not anything you did in between. And what I mean by that is if I hit record again, and I move this screw all the way over here, and then I move it back, and I stop recording. You can see this translate has appeared, but if I restart, you can see there, here's our first translate that happens, and the second one only moved it from where it started to where it ended. It didn't do the whole motion that I did. So just a note about how the record button works, it only checks the starting and ending positions of the element. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and right click on that, click delete because we don't need that translate. And actually this whole new channel that's been added, I can right click on that channel and delete the whole thing. Okay, so now I have a set of animations that I'm happy with for screw number 1. I can hold control, I can select all 3 of those time bars, right click on them, select copy. They're now stored in my copy system. Then I can right click again on the channel for battery screw number 2 that we already created here. And I can paste these time bars. And now you can see they've just been pasted exactly like they were for the first one. So now, if I go back and watch my animation over again, we get the exact same animation tap into both screws. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. The last thing I'm going to do is move this repeat line, which I can do one of two ways. The first is to actually click on it and drag it to a new place. And I can do that with both this repeat line and this red line indicating where we are in the animation. So this is kind of like the current place. I can also move the red line by left clicking. So wherever I left click in this top area here, that's where the red line is going to be. And wherever I right click in this top area, that's where the blue line is going to be. So I'm just going to move it to about a second after these animations complete. And as a general rule, that's a good place to have it. So what that's going to mean is if I now click play, these animations are going to happen. Then there's a second pause, and then they repeat. And you can adjust that to whatever suits your particular taste. I would say as a general rule, between a second and maybe a second and a half is good, just to give the user time to absorb what they've seen before the animation restarts. And actually, now that I'm thinking about this, there's one final thing we could add to this to make it look even better. And that is we can make the screws fade out after they have moved. So that way they're not kind of floating there at the end, but they actually fade out. So I'm actually going to go back here. I'm going to click. I can right click to add time bars that I choose. So right click and add a fade object in and out. You could also do that by clicking the plus time bar button here. I'm going to shorten this slightly so it's only half a second. Double click on it to edit its properties and change its setting from fade in to fade out. So now if I watch this again, screws are going to come out, and I only have this set for one of them right now, but now you can see that one screw fades out. So I'm just going to copy this one, paste it over here, and now nice and smooth, screws come, they fade out, the animation repeats. Okay, so now we have a completed first step that we're happy with. We can go up here and we can click this plus button. And what that plus button is going to do is continue the step from where we left off. So what that means is it's going to keep this interface that we've already built here. It's also going to continue from where the animation ends. So if I hit this plus button right now, you can see that those screws are actually no longer there. They're set to hidden, basically. And that's nice because it means I don't have to go back and hide the screws to pick up where I left off. It's just continued from where I was. We can also note that the step counter, that header that we created earlier with variables, has properly updated to now read step 2 of 2, and this now reads step 1 of 2. So building our second step, we're going to change the description because now we're no longer removing two screws. We are removing the battery cover. Okay, so our UI now reflects what we're going to show. And we're now going to select this battery cover, and we are going to create the animations for it to show it coming out of the back of the device. So there's a couple ways we could do this, and I'm actually going to use kind of a shortcut here. I'm going to go back to step 1, and I am going to copy everything except the translate, because I want to remake the translate because I know this battery cover is going to have to move farther than the screws moved. But that set object color, the highlight sphere, and the fade out, I'm going to select all those. I'm going to copy them, come back to step 2, add this element to the timeline. So that's this battery cover that I could select from the scene or select from the step hierarchy. And I'm actually going to paste these time bars right in here. So now I've sort of given myself a head start, and then I already have all those things that I created that I'm happy with. So if I play this, you can see all those things happen. However, the highlight sphere you can see has happened at the pivot point of this object, which for this particular asset is set over here. Now I'm not particularly happy with that actually. I don't want my highlight sphere over here because I think it kind of confuses the user. They might not know that I'm referring to this thing when the highlight sphere happens over there. So how can I fix that? Well, we can use the same kind of trick we used with the callouts, where we're going to create an empty object and then assign that highlight sphere to happen to that empty object. And that means we can place it wherever we want. So I'm going to do this create menu, create an empty object. You can see it appears here with its little box. I'm now going to look at it and move it one axis at a time over until it's pretty much right in front of this battery cover. So now that I have the empty object in a place that I like it, I can add it to the timeline. I can now click on this time bar that I already had created, this highlight sphere. I'm going to copy it. I'm then going to delete it from here. And then I can paste it down here. So now this empty object has a highlight sphere assigned to it. And if I click play, see that highlight sphere happens in a place that makes a lot more sense. And then this object changes color and eventually fades out. So the last thing we need to do is add that translate. Use the same process we did before. We're going to select the battery cover. We're going to hit record. Just going to drag it out, stop recording. And you can see that translate has automatically been added to the beginning here. It's actually going to add wherever I had my red line. So I'm now just going to take this time bar and move it until it starts at 2 seconds. And now if I click play, we get a highlight sphere, a color change, this thing moves, and then fades out. And I actually think that fade out happens a little quickly, so I'm going to move that fade out till half a second later. So now if I watch this, highlights, color changes, moves, and then fades out. And that's a pretty smooth motion right there. So final step, I can take this repeat line, drag it to about a second after that fade. That way my step is nice and complete. And there we go. Step 2 is completed. All right, hitting that plus button again. Now we're authoring step 3. I'm going to start going a little faster now just because we've already kind of shown the way this works. So now we are editing the UI to remove the battery. I'm actually going to go over and copy all of these, paste them. Oh, first I have to select my battery. So I'm going to select it from the drop-down menu here, add it to the timeline, paste these time bars in it that I already know I'm happy with. You can see my empty object, because I hit that plus button, remember it continued from where the previous step left off. So because I added the empty object to the previous step, it's now still here. I'm going to add it to the timeline as well. Come back, grab my highlight sphere time bar, paste it right in here. And now if I click play, get a highlight sphere, color change, that battery moves and fades out. Grab my repeat line and move it back to a place I'm happy with. Okay, so now I have this remove battery sequence. It has 3 steps in it. They are fully animated and they have descriptions. So if we remember back to the overall goal, the final thing we want to do is add another sequence that is the replace battery. Now we could go through and manually do this process in reverse, but there's actually a way we can do this a lot faster. So if I right click on this menu on the remove battery sequence, I'm given the option to duplicate it. So I'm going to do that. So now I have 2 sequences here that are this remove battery sequence. If I right click on the duplicated one, so that's called remove battery 1, I can now hit this button that says reverse sequence. I'm just going to click that. And what that's done is completely reversed the steps and the animations. Everything about this sequence is now backwards. So step 1 was now step 3. Step 3 is now step 1. And all these animations happen in reverse. So if we look at this first step here, if I click play, see that battery fades in, it slides in, it does a color change, and then there's a highlight sphere. So looking at that, I would maybe want to change the order of this color change versus translate, which I can just do by dragging these around. But if I hit play, changes color, moves in, and there's a highlight sphere to indicate that process is completed. So with 2 clicks, I now have almost a complete reverse sequence. So the last things I would need to do is go in and change the text description. So now instead of removing battery, we are replacing battery into the back of the ventilator. Step 2, we are now replacing the battery cover into the back of the ventilator. I can do that quick switch down here with the object color versus translate. And looking at this repeat line, maybe I want to move this to be a second later, just so it doesn't happen so closely after the highlight sphere. Going to step 1, we are replacing 2 screws into the back of the ventilator. Again, I'm going to click both these translates at the same time. So control selecting them, drag them over a little bit, do the same for the object colors and move them back. So if I actually expand this slightly, you can get a better view of what I just did there. So set it up so it looks like this. I'm going to move that repeat line just slightly. As I play this, those two screws fade in, they slide into the back of the ventilator, and they are now attached. So with that, we have successfully created the reverse sequence in just a couple of steps and some quick editing. All right, so we've arrived at a place where now we have the 3 sequences we said we wanted to create. Now we want to go back to our main sequence and wire these up, so to speak. So set it up so that when a user clicks on each of these links, it's going to direct them where they want to go. So for that, we're going to go back into the UI editor, and we can edit these options. So option 1, asset overview right here. We can see we want to set the target step to the asset overview step. So I've just done that. Option 1, asset overview, target, asset overview, overview step. Similarly for option 2, we're going to set that target to remove battery, step 1. And looking at this, I'm realizing that this sequence, its name never got changed. So instead of being remove battery 1, I'm just going to double click on the sequence and change it to replace battery. Just again, for my own personal housekeeping, so I can make sure I stay organized. Option 3, to replace battery. Now we can go down to replace battery. And these steps have been named backwards. I could go back and fix that. For me, it doesn't bother me too much. I know that they happen in the correct order, but if it bothers you, you could always just go in and change the titles of the steps. So now we've successfully wired up that menu, so each of these links leads the user where they want to go. There's one final thing that we can do, and this is just a nice thing for the user to have as well. So if we go into the window menu, and this is the menu that we haven't interacted with before, but this is where we control which windows are available to us in our sequence. So right now you can see the asset library is open, the step hierarchy is open, but some of these other ones are not. And one of the ones that's not, but that we want to interact with, is the sequence editor. So if I click on this, and I'm actually going to expand it to full screen for now, just so we can see it a little bit better. The sequence editor is a visual representation of all of the sequences and steps available in our project. So I'm going to go ahead and move these a little bit just so it's easier to see what's going on. So we can see here's our menu sequence. That's the first one we built that has our menu step on it. And then the 3 sequences that we added afterwards, the asset overview, the remove battery, and the replace battery. You can see we have these little green lines indicating that something is leading. And what those are is actually the menu that we added into the menu step. So this is showing that the user has that menu, and from that menu they can get to these 3 places. Now some of you might remember, oh hey, but we added headers into the content of each of these steps that lead the user back to the menu. And we did. And if we click on this connections view, you can see that the headers button is not activated. But if I click on that and toggle that on, so now it's showing header connections, we can now see that there's actually headers that lead from each of these sequences back here. So just a reminder, if I shrink this back down, this menu sequence, there's 3 buttons that lead to each of these sequences. That's these blue lines. Within the remove battery sequence, every single step has a main menu button that leads back to the main menu. That's these green lines. So looking at this, in terms of these connections, there's only one type of connection that we can add while we're in the sequence editor, one edit that we can make. And that is to the end of these sequences right here. So why would we want to do that? Well, let's go to remove battery step 3. If I just shrink this back down. So we're on remove battery, we're on step 3. We can see there's still an arrow right here that would allow the user to go to the next step. But there aren't any more steps in the sequence. We're on step 3 of 3. So where does this arrow lead? What would happen if the user clicked on it? Well, right now, nothing. This arrow doesn't do anything. But if we go back to the sequence editor, we can control where the last next step arrow on the last step of a sequence takes them. So where might we want it to go? Well, let's imagine the user is actually performing this process. So they've removed the battery. Well, the next thing they might want to do is they might want to then replace the battery, because obviously they're still going to need a battery in this device. So we can actually drag our own little red connection from the end of the remove battery sequence to the beginning of the replace battery sequence. And what that means is when the user clicks that next arrow on step 3 of 3 of the remove battery sequence, it's actually going to take them to the first step of this replace battery sequence. So that's just a little added piece of functionality that might be useful for our users so that they can go through this process in a linear manner and don't have to go back to the menu and then back to this step. So what would we want to happen after they've finished? Well, once they've finished replacing the battery, presumably they're done. So the only place they might want to go is back to the main menu. Oh, didn't quite land that there. There we go. So the user can navigate back to the main menu from the end of the replace battery sequence. For the asset overview, you'll remember if we can actually close out of the sequence editor now. We didn't have a next arrow, so there's nowhere for that to lead, and we don't really need it to lead anywhere. The asset overview is its own kind of standalone thing. So with that, we've now completed the authoring for this entire brief basic project. So before we're done, the first thing we should do is press the simulate button. And that simulate button is going to allow us, like we did at the beginning, to simulate what this experience would be like for a user in the WorkLink app. So I'm going to hit the simulate button. You can see I'm prompted to place my content. I now have this menu here, and I can now basically go through and test to make sure that everything I've done works correctly. So if I click Asset Overview, see that it correctly navigates me to this step. I can now go back, click on the Remove Battery. You can see our animations are happening as we would expect. As we click through this, we can check that they all look the way we would expect them to. We can also confirm that this main menu button leads us back to the main menu. Final thing to check, if we come back to this Remove Battery and we click to step 3 of 3, if we click this next arrow, we can check that that takes us to step 1 of 3 in the replace battery sequence. So with that, we've now confirmed that the way we authored this is functioning as intended. And we can now hit this publish button, and that would allow us to publish the experience to then go view it in the WorkLink app. So if I hit this button, don't need to worry about anything here. All we need to do is just press publish. We can see that projects can begin publishing. You could then go to the WorkLink app on your iOS, Android, or HoloLens device of choice, log in with the same login credentials you used for WorkLink Create, and experience your basic project in AR in your space. And I would encourage you to do that as the final piece of following along to this video. So with that, that is the end of the basic project tutorial. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.